Welcome to the 300th Apollo Papyrus Podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the 300th episode, my interview guest is a comedy writer who has worked with, among others, Jay Leno, David Letterman, and Joan Rivers. As an author, he has written 2 books, Live from the Beginning of Time and Thank You for Not Talking. His name is Ben Alper, and my interview with Ben will follow the teleportation sound. Ben Alper, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Aaron.
As I start most of my interviews, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay, well, my name is Ben Alper. I am a comedy writer, and you probably have never heard of me because I'm one of those guys who always works in the background. I've spent a career working as a freelance comedy writer, which means I write things and I send them to people and they perform them. The people you've probably heard that you would recognize that I've written for are people like Jay Leno and David Letterman and Joan Rivers. I started off, like a lot of people on a very small scale. I was right after college, I was doing a small cable TV show, and I was doing that for a few years. And I was getting a lot of laughs, but I had no idea if I was funny until one time I sent out some material to various celebrities and agents and things like that. And I got a very nice letter back from Bob Newhart, a handwritten letter telling me that he thought I was very talented and I had a lot of potential. So at that point, I said, well, I guess I can do this work. And I just kept writing. I kept writing for, in the beginning, newsletters for disc jockeys, for instance. There was one called the Electric Weenie, where you would write jokes and they would go into a monthly newsletter or a weekly newsletter for disc jockeys who subscribed to it to use on their shows. And then I started writing for another newsletter called Bob Orban's Current Comedy, which was a newsletter for speakers. And then eventually I started selling material to Joan Rivers. And I did that for a few years, and that was kind of fun. And then after a few more years after that, I had sent some material to Jay Leno's manager, and she wrote me back and said, here's a contract, just keep sending the material. And I wrote for Jay Leno from about the time he started as the guest host for Johnny Carson, which was towards the end of Johnny Carson's run in around 1992, till the time where Jay Leno finished his run on The Tonight Show, which was 2013. And then right after that, a friend of mine who said to me, well, I know a producer for Letterman. Would you like to write for that show? So I said, sure. And within a couple of weeks, I was sending in jokes for David Letterman. And I did that until he was finished. And then I just decided on top of all of that, I've always done other kinds of writing. I've written op-ed pieces for newspapers. I've written for other comedians. I've written for jokes for roasts. And anybody who needed something funny to say, they would hire me. Professional people, business people who were going to make a speech and needed something funny to add to their speeches. And I also continued on, which I have until today, which is I have two of my own newsletters. They're subscription based. One is called Bay State Bombast. It's a weekly listing of jokes about things that are happening in my hometown in Boston and Massachusetts. And I have another weekly newsletter just called Ben Alper's News and Jokes, that's more like a regular monologue from a late night TV show, because I write jokes about just current events and things like that. And also around the time I ended writing for Jay Leno, I said, well, maybe I should write something about myself. And I thought, well, what do I know? And I said, well, I know I'm an introvert. So I wrote a funny book called Thank You for Not Talking, a laughable look at introverts, which is just all funny look. It's just a comedy book about introverts. And then a few years ago, I started and then just recently finished a book called Live from the Beginning of Time, Late Night Comedy Monologues Through the Ages. And it's a hypothetical. I thought, people get their information today from late night comedy hosts. What if there had been comedy hosts, late night comedy hosts from the beginning of time? What would that be like? So I wrote this book. It's a series of comedy monologues starting around, let's see, from billions of years ago when man first started to walk on two legs. It starts there and it goes up to about the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a series of comedy monologues, and also it has some desk pieces in it. A desk piece in the comedy business, the late night comedy business, are those funny routines the hosts tell when they're sitting behind their desks after they've done the monologues. So I have some of those too. And I think that about covers about everything I have been doing and am doing. So I continue to write jokes, and I am constantly working on an idea for the next book, which is still in its extremely early stages. And I'm just one of these people who, number one, has always just liked working by himself as a freelancer. So my favorite place to be is, I guess, sitting at my desk in the morning by myself writing. And I'm a political junkie too. So I just love, and a news junkie. So one of my favorite things to do is to just watch the news all the time, or read the news, mostly on the computer, and then each week write jokes about them.
Okay, you answered the next two questions I have, which is a little bit about both of your books. So I have a couple of questions about one of your books, Live from the Beginning of Time. Did you write that entirely from your experience as a late night comedy writer, or did you have to do quite a bit of research for it?
Well, knowing how to write the jokes that's comes from being a comedy writer. In terms of what I wrote about, I had to, as you're reading this book, you have to imagine that someone is standing up on stage telling jokes to you. So I couldn't make it. I had to make sure that most of these had to do with events and things that happened that people were kind of familiar with. Because if I wrote about something that no one knew anything about, I'd have to spend too much time explaining what it was all about. And it really wouldn't sound like a monologue. So, for example, one of the monologues is called "Fire Discovered by Humans," 1 million BC. So I have these jokes, and you have to imagine, as I did. I mean, that to me, that's the challenge, and the interesting part is to imagine someone up there telling these jokes and write them so that the reader can imagine someone listening to a comedian. So, it starts off with a guy saying, there's this new thing called fire, or as many people are calling it, ouch, what is that? It's amazing what you can do with fire, like burn to death. Fire is hard to describe, particularly since we have a vocabulary of only 3 words and 5 grunts. And it goes on and on like that most of these are about 7 jokes. So I did have to do some research. For example, one day I'm just thinking, someone must have invented chewing gum. How did that happen? So I just looked up online, who invented chewing gum, and found some articles about it. And then I wrote a monologue, as if someone's saying, hey, there's this new thing called chewing gum, as if the audience had never heard of it. So it does require some research. But I would say for most of these, I thought about, I need to find things that people are kind of familiar with, like the invention of the light bulb or the invention of the telephone or the signing of the Declaration of Independence. There were a couple where I knew people wouldn't be familiar with, but I just decided to put them in because I thought they were really interesting and easy to explain. For instance, the in this country, the whiskey rebellion, or some things like that. A few short ones like that. But I also basically went through a lot of it just to make sure I had the dates correct and the people's names correct.
Another interesting aspect of your book, Life from the Beginning of Time, it features endorsements from long deceased historical figures like Attila the Hun and Harry Houdini, which are obviously comedic in nature and not actual endorsements of your book. Why did you decide to include these comedic endorsements? And I found the Harry Houdini one particularly funny, by the way, for Life from the Beginning of Time.
Well, I didn't write those until we were putting together the book cover. And I said, I got to put something on the back. Had to put something on the back cover to get people interested. My theory has always been, if you are selling your humor, write something funny, make people laugh, so that they would look at it and say, well, if this is funny, if the back of the book is funny, this probably the inside is. So I have quotations on the back of the book. There are 4 of them. First one is, I laughed until I conquered, by Attila the Hun. The Harry Houdini one was, if I've read anything funny or it escapes me. And I had one, my comedy is divine, but Ben Alper is de bomb, by Dante Alighieri. And the last one was, speak softly and carry a big shtick, Theodore Roosevelt. I did the same thing with the introvert book. I had some quotations on the back. I said what the critics are saying. Thank you for not talking answers the nagging question, who are introverts and why don't they do the wave at sporting events, from drunkfans.com. Superbly written, no American author better captures the angst of being asked, so what do you do for a living? William Nervosa, author of The Elements of Guile. And thank you for not talking is required reading for anyone who's ever considered fleeing a noisy gathering through a bathroom window. Del Harris, author of Guess Who's Leaving for Dinner. So that's if you said, what do I do best? It's write funny lines. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do, but it just happens to be a skill I have. In some ways, I consider myself kind of an idiot savant in that this is something I know how to do, but there are certain everyday skills that I would say a lot of people have that are challenging for me. Hence the identifying as an introvert. So it's just what I do. It's what I think, and if you ask me what makes a comedy writer, one of the things is a comedy writer is always looking for something funny. A comedy writer is, when they're walking down the street and they see things and they think, that would be a funny idea. That's kind of weird. Let me write that down, or I'll remember that, or just it's a funny thought. And sometimes it just surprises me when I talk to people and I can see that they don't observe those things, or they're not even thinking about them, where I go, well, that's just the way my mind works.
How long did it take you to write each of your books?
Each one took a few years, but I wasn't really working on them full time. The last one I think took 2 years, and it was kind of interesting because I kind of shaped it as I went along. I mean, when I started writing Live from the Beginning of Time, I just started writing these monologues, and I wasn't doing them in any particular order. I would just think, hey, I should probably do one on Sigmund Freud, and I did one on Freud, and things would just come to me. And then as I got closer to the end, I started to shape it a little bit. I mean, the most obvious way is to put them into chronological order, and then I divided them up. One section is world history, the other one is American history. And what surprised me, and I wasn't even intending this, is in the end, it comes out reading like a little humorous history book. And I didn't realize that until people who bought it and read it, or friends who read it, said, "Oh, this is it's like I'm reading a little history book." And I thought, yeah, I guess that's what it is. So that's how it turned out. But I just kept writing here and there. And, I would set little goals for myself. I'd say every day I'd have to write X amount. I mean, I've always done that. I mean, I'm just, I keep a strict regimen where I get up every day to write things. I get up every day to look for ideas or things like that. So this was just another added part of my routine. The introvert book was a little different in that I started writing these and just posting them on a blog. And then finally I said, maybe this could be a book, but I'm not sure how it's organized. But I sent it to an agent who wrote me back, who really liked it. And then I realized, okay, now I got to work a little bit harder and organize the book a little more. And that took a little more time to organize. But it's everything I do is up until now has been more short bits, sketches, lists, short essays, and things like that. So it just I don't know if I could work on one thing and nothing else at once. It would probably kind of wear me down.
Are both of your books self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for each of your books?
The first book, I had an agent and she just could not find a publisher, so I self-published it. And it's done well. And the second book, I couldn't find an agent, and I self-published it as well. And I mean, I may eventually get a publisher for it. But I thought the best thing to do is just get it out there, and then it might be easier for me to then get a publisher. It hasn't been out there for that long.
My final question is going to be about your op-eds. What are some topics you've written op-ed articles about? And do you just write op-eds for your two newsletters, or have there been publications that feature your articles?
I haven't written one for a number of years, but I used to write them now and then for the Boston Herald, and they were about politics. But for instance, I remember one I wrote about Hillary Clinton, and it was essentially a series of jokes, funny things about Hillary Clinton in her campaign for president, and everything was about politics. But I would just I was considered the one of their funny writers. I also did a thing for them for 1 year. They had a weekly section in their paper where they had 4 pundits weigh in on an issue, and I was the resident comedian. The 3 other people were mostly political strategists and consultants. So but I would always try. That was my brand. I would always try and find a funny take on things. And I remember when it was during the election period and they were having debates, there would be a debate on TV, and then in a couple of hours I had to send in a little take on who I thought did well and didn't. So it was very interesting because as I said before, I'm a political junkie.
Ben, you were an interesting guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus Podcast. I almost referred to this podcast by its former name.
Okay. Well, Aaron, I've really enjoyed it. It was a pleasure talking with you.
It's been an amazing experience to produce 300 episodes for this podcast, and I look forward to producing many more episodes. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.